Greetings and bienvenue, Midnight Crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast, and welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
Some viewers may find the following video disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised.
When I was young, I came to witness something terrible which could not be explained by human science. And over the years, I tried, with little success, to ignore and forget those memories which seemed to claw at the back of my brainstem during my waking hours, and leave me staring with bloodshot eyes into the darkness on sleepless nights such as this. I have considered putting my experience down into writing for several decades now. But every time I tried to record these events, I have hesitated. Perhaps because for a long time I still wished to believe that my memories were somehow incorrect, or that my mind had played tricks on me that day. Or perhaps it was because I simply did not want to think about the grotesque truth. But no. The true reason that I never attempted to speak openly of the incident is that I was terrified that someone might choose to investigate my story. And then, desiring to expose my ridiculous claims, or perhaps out of simple human curiosity, this person might journey to the same location that I did that summer, and in doing so, unintentionally awaken that indescribable thing that slumbers beneath the stonelands, that revolting entity that could so easily overtake humanity and deal to it a fate far worse than death. But that is a risk that I am now willing to take. I think that carrying such a weighty secret with me continues to eat away at my mind day by day, and perhaps if I speak the truth just once, I will be able to gain some kind of peace, however slight. I must apologize in advance for my slow typing skills, which will likely require me to take several hours to document everything that happened. I have not planned out or pre-written this account, and so I must slowly transcribe my experiences to you in real time. The incident in question occurred 40 years ago. The only people who knew anything about the incident were my parents. They had discovered me that day at the entrance of a cave. I was curled up in an alcove, drenched in sweat and lying in a pool of my own vomit. My eyes were staring into the distance, and I could not stop screaming in a hoarse, raspy gargle. I had only been missing for roughly 2 hours, and they could not imagine what I had seen that might have traumatized me in such a short amount of time. Several years prior to this, my parents had lived and worked on the international compound at Dahran. I had gone to a boarding school in Switzerland, and only returned to visit with my parents during vacations. The company actively funded its employees' vacations, and we were able to travel to exotic locales in Tehran, Beirut, and Greece. And there my interests were piqued by the ancient monuments and monolithic architecture from eons past. In these remnants of archaic civilizations, my mind could wander, and I could fantasize about the great rulers who had constructed such things. One summer, my parents received a recommendation from a co-worker about a very interesting vacation spot. He was a fellow geologist of Palestinian stock who had studied in America and had a keen interest in the history of the Near East. He suggested that we travel to a remote archaeological site that lay within the kingdom itself. He spoke of the ruins at Hegra. This site dated back to classical antiquity and was virtually unknown at the time, outside of academic circles. It had been founded by the Nabateans around the time of Alexander's conquests, and it had remained in use for many centuries after that, ultimately falling into the hands of the Romans and later the Arabs. By ancient accounts, the Nabateans were a loose group of peoples who grew wealthy from the trade in spices and incense. Initially, they had many strict taboos. They did not farm or partake in wine. They never owned slaves or followed kings, and indeed they refused to ever have a determinate home, preferring to live in the desert as nomads. In their eyes, any man who possessed these things could be easily compelled by powerful men to do what is ordered of them. And the Nabateans, valuing their freedom above all else, saw this as the worst possible crime. That is why it is so curious that one day, seemingly without any provocation, the Nabateans began carving massive structures into the sheer rock at Petra and Hegra. These sites were notoriously well concealed. The now famous city of Petra was built in a tangle of canyons, and was only accessible to those who already knew the circuitous path into the valley, and the site of Hegra was built in the middle of the northern desert of Arabia. and so we decided to travel into the interior of the country to visit these curious ruins. Khalil, my parents' friend, had been made a naturalized Saudi citizen, and so it was easy for him to arrange our visit without us being hassled as outsiders. We arrived by automobile on a searing hot day, even more so than I was used to. The sun was beating down on us oppressively. It sapped our energy and made it difficult to enjoy the unique and unusual architecture of the city. The area was wholly unguarded, and we were the only people near the actual ruins. In my travels, I had never visited a site that was ancient and majestic, while simultaneously being so thoroughly ignored. I was told by Khalil that the reason behind the site's apparent abandonment was due to the notoriously superstitious and primitive notions of the Arabs. The men who carved this place were heathens, and the thought of casually visiting a site that was so strongly associated with idolatry is a terrifying notion to the common Arab. Indeed, they told stories that this was the site of Thamud, a primitive and evil city that existed in antediluvian times that was destroyed by God after they had rejected his laws. In truth, historians noted that the Nabateans had indeed worshipped a strange god. Initially, they had casually worshipped Al-Qam, the protector of caravans, who was a common and benign god that many early Arabs had followed. But the focus of their worship suddenly shifted when they started building their cities. They started worshipping an entity called Dul al-Shara, the Lord of the Mountain. This being was always represented as a simple stone block, and the Nabateans curiously never inscribed or adorned his shrines. Unlike their original god, this new deity was malign, fearful, and required numerous sacrifices at their holy festivals, which were held twice a year. However, ancient sources remain curiously quiet on the subject of what exactly these sacrifices entailed. It was a stunning sight. Surrounding us in all directions was a seemingly endless expanse of stone. The area was once volcanic, and instead of the rolling sea of sand which exists in the south of Arabia, this land looked as though it had been paved with primeval, carmine-colored rock. And out of the ground, a small collection of rocky crags jutted into the air, and into these jagged scarps, the buildings were carved. They had been roughly chiseled in, and the creators seemed to lack a proper knowledge of masonry, since it seemed unpolished, and deep gashes from their pickaxes were left in plain view. But the architects more than made up for this with their dedication and impressive designs, which were unlike anything I had ever seen before. The later structures had some elements of Greco-Roman design in them, incorporating pillars and pediments. But there were other elements which seemed unusual. The tops of the structures featured stepped gables, which rose like a sort of staircase or primitive pyramid. And all of the structures, new and old, seemed to have curious sharp edges in their design, as though a cubic motif had been integrated into the common Mediterranean designs. More curiously, the insides were simple and unadorned, with long rectangular holes carved into the walls. What I did not know at the time was that this was not technically a city in the traditional sense. Every structure in every known Nabatean settlement was the same, with a square, one-room compartment sculpted directly into a rock cliff face, and each structure served the same purpose, to house the dead. These were expansive necropolises that apparently were designed with the singular goal of containing tombs. The rectangular recesses that were whittled into the walls were designed to fit a human body inside. Some of the openings were tiny, apparently meant to house children and infants, and others were very large, possibly meant to house several bodies together. Curiously, we could find no human remains, and in my later research I found that no Nabatean sites, despite being meant exclusively for the internment of the dead, had ever unearthed a single human body. But this was just one of the many bizarre mysteries that the Nabateans had. In a way, the Nabateans are one of the most infuriating civilizations to archaeologists. Their ruins are covered in small carvings, graffiti, written in their native script. And these engravings seem to indicate that nearly every member of the society was literate, from the highest lord to the lowliest shepherd. However, they left behind seemingly no monumental inscriptions, and there is no indication that they ever produced any literature. It seems that their literacy was mainly used for business transactions and bookkeeping. This was either out of a universal lack of interest on their part, or perhaps out of some sort of taboo that they held against recording any information about their history and culture, out of fear that outsiders might use this information unwisely. We spent much of our time at Hegra in the shade of the buildings, but even that did not give us much relief from the heat. Several hours in, we had explored the inside of many of the structures and taken a nice collection of photos when Khalil's wife began to grow lightheaded. So we decided that we might leave for now and find a place to lodge for the night. But on our way back, we encountered a problem. The road we were on, if it can even be called a road, was a choppy mess of volcanic tuff, and after hitting a particularly rough dip, one of our tires was punctured with a bellowing crack. Now the only option was to walk to the nearest town by foot and get assistance. This luckily was not too harrowing, as we were only about 20 miles from the town, and it was approaching dusk at this point. My father and Khalil volunteered to make the journey, and I was left with my mother and Khalil's wife. After the first hour, I was not only being broiled alive inside the car with my clothes entirely slick and sticky with sweat, but I was also getting immensely bored. Outside the car was the expanse thick volcanic stone that had changed color from the deep rust of Hegra to a darker blackish burgundy, and I desperately wanted to explore this alien landscape that perhaps no other man had seen in centuries. So I got permission from the women to go exploring, ostensibly just around the nearby area in search of some shade that we could hide from the sun in. The only items I took with me were a canteen of water and my keychain, which had attached to it a small folding pocket knife and a miniature flashlight. I was so intrigued by the strange allochthonous formations in the black rock that I naturally allowed myself to wander far away from the car. And after some time, with the heat radiating up off the stone ground and draining my energy with each clumsy step, I looked back and saw that the car was now just a speck in the distance. Not wasting to journey further out of sight from the car, I examined the nearby area, and soon I happened across a small opening in the ground, a sort of thin crevice. It was large enough to stick my head and shoulders inside and peer around, and inside I saw that this fissure opened up into a lava tube of considerable size which stretched and branched out into the distance. This was all the incentive I needed, and as soon as I could guarantee that the footholds were secure enough to support my weight, I descended into the hole to do more exploring. At first I was so overwhelmed by the thick, torrid cave air that I almost gave up and left immediately. But I decided to explore just a little further, at least until I could not stand the heat anymore. But to my surprise, the cave cooled off considerably as I walked deeper in. After walking into one of the nearby caverns, it was quite comfortable. Physically, this cave was much different than I expected a proper cavern to look like. I was used to depictions of caves with stalactites and flowing rock drapery, but this was just an unadorned black tunnel. Occasionally, some roots would hang down from the ceiling, undoubtedly from some long-dead xeric shrubbery, and sometimes I would find little piles of bones which disturbed me, but were almost certainly just from some small rodent which had fallen into the chasm and starved to death. Besides those simple features, it was just a knobby black tunnel with several other shafts branching out. I rounded a soft corner and soon I needed to use my flashlight to see properly. I decided to take my time, since I was very much enjoying the soothing temperature here, and did not relish the idea of climbing up through the ravine and then making the long trek back to the car. I figured that it must only be an hour before it grew colder with twilight, and I could spend that time down here, seeing how deep I could go. First, my flashlight fell upon something that caught my eye in the distance. It was like a collection of specks that clung to the ceiling, which glinted and sparkled in the light. Initially, I foolishly thought that perhaps these were diamonds or some other precious gemstone. But upon closer inspection, I found that they were droplets of water, which had condensed on the stone. I was very much intrigued by this. I thought that perhaps this condensation had come from a nearby source, an underwater cistern perhaps. I had heard stories from Khalil on the journey here about how the Nabateans had constructed vast subterranean rain catches all throughout the desert. This gave them a sort of mobility that no other desert tribe had, and had allowed them to gain vast riches through their otherwise impassable desert trade routes. So I pushed further into the cave, looking for some hidden reservoir or sealed stone tank. It was now extremely dark, and my small flashlight was the only illumination in the area. I followed the beads of water deeper into the cavern, and soon I saw something that confused me. At first I thought that through some trick of thermics, the water had somehow frozen into long translucent icicles. But upon closer examination, I saw that these were true crystals which had started growing out of the cave, alongside the water. The mineral had a crystalline formation with cubic cleavage, like large blocks of rock salt or fluorite. They were a soft, limpid, milky color with a clean, smooth texture. And as I trod further into the cave, the number of crystals multiplied, and soon they jutted out of the ground and the walls like tiny collections of glass cubes. As I looked at them, I began to notice a peculiar phenomenon. Initially, my flashlight had been almost entirely useless. It was intended to be used casually to look under a seat or in a glove box, not illuminate an entire cave. I had struggled to see my surroundings initially, and I had needed to hold the flashlight up in the air to clearly see the water. Yet now I could see my surroundings quite clearly. I turned off my flashlight and waited for my eyes to adjust to the darkness. But to my surprise, I could see the surrounding cave with some clarity. I stared for some time to make sure that this wasn't some sort of illusion, and soon I was sure of what I was witnessing. The crystals were glowing. They shined with a pale white light that illuminated the passage, albeit faintly. At the time, I thought this was just a very curious phenomenon, but I have since learned that no other crystal on Earth naturally emits light as these did. I can only attribute their odd properties to some sort of luminescent bacteria or chemical, but I cannot say for sure. And as I continued walking, soon I saw a surreal image of the cavern entirely composed of the radiant crystals. It was as though I was inside of a jagged quartz tube, and my feet stumbled numerous times, causing me to drop to my knees and scrape my legs. Then I stumbled once more and heard a sharp cracking twang from underneath me. As I attempted to stand up, the ground became loose under my feet. I crouched there, very still, and attempted not to move. It was as though the ground was giving out beneath me. If I was to fall, I did not know where I would end up, or if I would ever get out of this hole again. And as I tried to delicately balance and stand, I felt the earth give way under me. I must be very careful when I explain what happens next. I shut my eyes and clenched my teeth as I fell, holding myself into a fetal position. The rocks cut deeply into my arms and legs as I tumbled downwards. Then I was briefly in free fall as fell through the air, and I was sure that I would not survive now. But I landed on a hard stone surface, coated in a thick, sticky substance. The warm, gooey substance cohered to my clothes and skin, and I instinctively tried to lift my head up, but it hung fast like molasses or tar. And when I breathed in, I smelt that malodorous stench of rotting flesh and putrescent fetor. I felt the bile rise up into my throat as that grotesque odor invaded my nostrils. And as I struggled to get up, I felt the unmistakable feeling of movement across my body. I opened my eyes, which had been firmly shut up until this point, and I saw vermin everywhere. Centipedes, roaches, beetles, worms, all of them wriggling across the ground as a writhing mass of chitin, with their skittering legs and wriggling antennae touching all over my body as they squirmed under my shirt and tried to slither into my nose. I instinctively screamed, and in the instant a few of the creatures immediately climbed inside my mouth. I already had tears rolling down my face when I felt something grab me and yank me out of the mulch in one clean tug. I looked at the thing that had picked me up and let loose another cry. I'm not sure how to adequately describe the thing that held me with one hand and examined me, digging into the loose skin of my back with its nails. The first thing I saw was its face, in some ways human, but in other ways grotesquely misshapen and alien. The overall shape was like that of some sort of swine, short and oval-shaped, with a snout-like nose and wide nostrils. It had tiny black spherical eyes that were sunken in its skull, perhaps atrophied from lack of use. Its ears were like that of a bat, very large and pointed but perhaps more limp. Its skin was pale white, hairless, and hung loosely from the body. The creature's thick, sallow tongue, covered in large, round bumps all over the top and sides of it, hung out the front of its mouth. The mouth itself was lipless and pulled into a tight little line, with two large teeth or tusks curving up from the bottom jaw. The creature examined me, and looking back, I suppose it had a look of disgust or confusion on its face, since it was contorted, and it made snorting noises as it inspected my body. I flailed my limbs and struggled as hard as I could, but the creature didn't seem to take notice. He threw me back onto the revolting ground, and I immediately attempted to crawl away. But the thing knelt down and grabbed my shirt and pressed my face into the slime. He pulled so hard at my shirt that it lifted me off of the ground slightly, and then with another jerk, the shirt was ripped cleanly off. He kept one hand on the back of my head, shoving my face into the muck so thoroughly that I could not breathe, and when I attempted to, more of the misshapen insects forced themselves inside of my nose and mouth, and I could feel their little potameres digging into my flesh, tickling me and coughing me to cough and wheeze underneath the ooze. Next, it tugged and ripped at my shorts until I was completely naked in the pool of mud. It picked me up and flung me over its shoulder, and although I fought and screamed and cried, the swine beast easily ignored me and carried me away. My eyes shot around frantically, and I saw glimpses of the environment, and I smelt it and felt it. The low ceiling, made from trillions of hanging cubes, that same luminescent crystal that I had seen earlier, was providing a dim, sickly white light for this cavern. The ground, I saw that expanse like a field of the bugs and that gooey tar and the pasture of fungus. There, growing like crops, there were varieties, cultivars of it, growing there, planted in rows in the slime. Something in the distance, the destination. This being was carrying me towards the city, an entire city carved directly into the cave, with cubic buildings with stepped gables with clean, smooth stone. The creature itself, its body, it was naked, its skin soft and loose and pale, its jewelry, strange gold and silver jewelry that it wore in piercings in the folds of its skin, and it smelled but not of rot like the slime did, but it smelled but rust shavings and musk. And its round torso and the meaty legs with cloven feet and the fingers, pudgy but with long triangular orange-pointed nails. The noise in there. Katak, 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 I heard it. The noise echoed and dug in, and then again it did. Katak, 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 katak.
Lol, I thought you were gonna Shrek us.
I apologize for my lateness. Some time ago I came here to disclose information regarding a terrifying ordeal that I experienced one summer day when I was young. I have already told you about my expedition to the ruins of the ancient necropolis at Hegra, and I have spoken for some length about countless mysteries and eccentricities of the now extinct society, known in ancient times as the Nabataeans, that dug these monolithic rock-hewn tombs into the cursed antediluvian stone of Jabal Atlab. I had only begun to explain how I journeyed into that cave, and how I was captured by that grotesque swine thing who carried me away to the unnamed city. But I have yet to elucidate on the most appalling and deranged things I saw in those fathomless depths. I have hesitated this long out of the dread I feel when I let my mind wander back to that sunken colony and their practices. But now my mind is made of steel, and I know that I must finish what I have started. Again, I must apologize for my slow typing ability. I'm writing this in real time, and so it shall proceed slowly. You may expect another section roughly every 30 minutes. The area was cavernous. The ceiling was perhaps 100 meters high. It retained the general shape of the other areas of the lava tube, rounded black volcanic stone with no trace of stalactites or stalagmites. And the ceiling was an endless blanket of those crystals which glowed with a sickly white phosphorescence. The swine thing carried me, now naked, towards a collection of structures that I did not, at the time, understand the function of. Around the ground and ceiling were a jumble of massive, monolithic geometric shapes, primarily cubes, but also incorporating aspects of pyramidal structures and prismatic protrusions. These were stacked on top of one another in a haphazard fashion, and they seemed to intersect and connect with one another seamlessly, with no apparent melding points. This was all constructed of a deep black substance, rock, I assumed, the same color and texture as the rest of the cave. We neared these strange creations, crossing through the vile muck and mire, with the swine thing carrying me on its back, like a piece of dead meat. I looked around frantically, and out here, in the expansive plain beyond the unnamed city, I saw the fungal plains. This was the place which I had landed initially, in my fall. There was perhaps half of a foot of muck in all directions, putrid and smelling of excrement. And out of this slime, vast swaths of color were easily visible. As I looked closer, I saw that they were tilled fields filled with multicolored mushrooms, moss, lichens, and other coprophagous and carrion-scavenging fungi. In the fields I could see more of the swine things, kneeling and gathering the fungi into simple leather satchels. Others were walking casually through the fields, throwing some sort of dust or debris into the fields at carefully defined intervals. At the time, I did not understand the purpose of this. I'm sorry, perhaps I've consumed too much alcohol in an attempt to steady my nerves. I suspect that my writing is suffering as a result. But I should continue. I continued fighting against my captor, who, for the most part, ignored my pathetic attempts at escape. And as we neared, I saw the unnamed city more clearly. The simple structures which blanketed both the ground and the ceiling were roughly between 2 and 5 meters in height, with ramps and stairways connecting each of the buildings. In the center of the settlement was a colossal pillar, perhaps hundreds of meters in circumference at the largest sections. It took on a sort of hourglass shape. It clung to the ground and roof tightly, but narrowed in a parabolic arch to only a dozen or so meters in the center. And to my surprise, this enormous structure, likely the largest rock-cut building on Earth, was composed entirely of cubes. The cubes stacked, piled, and collapsed in on one another, and they converged at weird angles, as though they had been carved that way. However, it should be noted that the surface seemed perfectly smooth on each, and as I looked closer, I saw that this central pillar was writhing with activity. Thousands of the swine things could be seen walking along the connecting ramparts, or moving inside of this cyclopean hive. This place, I must assume, based on my experiences, was home to the living quarters of these creatures, and the smaller, simple structures that haphazardly littered the ground and clung fast to the cave ceiling were intended for work. Soon we entered the city itself. The thing carried me through the squarely stepped pyramidal arch into the city proper, and the instant we passed through, I felt the breath freeze in my chest as I saw a complete society of those things, walking through the streets and looking towards me with an expression of revolution and shock, with many of them turning to walk closer for a more thorough examination of my body. Many of the beasts grabbed my limbs and examined my body with a sort of sick curiosity. They communicated with each other in a sort of sickening noise that cut through me like a knife. It seemed to be a sort of clicking language, like those of the African Khoisan peoples, except interspersed with guttural groans. This language involved an unmistakable repetitive click of their wide, knobby tongues that sounded to my ears like the word katak. And this repetitive noise echoed all around me, inches from my ears as they grabbed and pulled all over my body with their thick, sweaty palms and sharp yellow fingernails. It nauseated me, and I instinctively shut my eyes and clenched my teeth, even as that clicking noise grew louder in my ears and the hot, wet breath poured over my entire body. But suddenly, the swine thing that had captured me spun to its right very quickly and made a roaring screech. The other creatures seemed to remain still, but continued to speak to one another in their barbaric language. My captor gave a short speech, motioning to me from time to time, and proceeded to continue walking down this rock-cut street. On the journey, the crowd thinned out somewhat, although a few continued to follow us. It took perhaps an hour of walking to reach our destination. I decided shortly after that I must keep my eyes open at all costs and examine my surroundings. Even though it hurt me to look at these monstrosities, I decided that I had a sort of obligation to study this place, which perhaps no humans before or since had ever visited from the outside world. Here is what I came to know about the society of the swine things. The creatures themselves never wore clothes. At the time, I did not attribute any reason to this beside their general savageness, but in retrospect, I suppose that they did not have any way of harvesting fibers to craft textiles. So instead, they seemed to have coated their bodies in powdered pigments. I saw more than a few of the individuals crouched in a corner, slathering themselves in a fine white dust. Rarer were individuals with red or dark blackish-purple pigments smeared on their bodies. Individuals with this darker pigment seemed to also have far more golden or brassy piercings and decorative jewelry hanging off of their skin folds, and I recognized that both the color and the decorative baubles likely were a sign of status. Indeed, those without any coloring or decoration seemed to be performing the most menial of tasks. In stark contrast to the fungal fields, the metropolitan area had no discernible dirt, grim, flora, or any sort of biological material. Excepting the swine things themselves, the architecture of the entire community, with its bizarre cascading geometric shapes, seemed to be carved directly out of the cave stone. However, the black granitic surface bore no signs of tool marks and had been polished to a mirror sheen. The creatures seemed to be completely obsessed with rectilinear designs, and each building was made with sharp angles at all corners, with designs fashioned into the sides of each structure in the shape of cubic protrusions and flat jutting causeways connecting each building. Each building had a wide, squarish doorway, typically with a nearby incline or stairway leading to a higher level. However, altogether, the structures of the basic ground settlements did not rise above perhaps 4 meters in height at the maximum. Their intelligence is at least on the same level as human beings from third-world countries. They certainly have a complex language and advanced technology that roughly mimics that of humans at the turn of the 20th century. They have a sort of power that seems similar in some respects to electricity, but in other ways is wholly different. It was a sort of iridescent and luminescent ether, transported in glass tubes throughout the metropolitan area. Looking back on this power source, I am reminded of the strange power sources of fiction, such as Edward Bulwer Lytton's Vril or William Hope Hodgson's Earth Current. This energy seemed to be used for lighting, both in the streets and in the various buildings. It also seemed to be easily converted into raw mechanical energy for operating everything from massive machinery and simple appliances, which I glimpsed inside the buildings for mere seconds at a time. However, despite these impressive technological feats, as far as I can tell, they do not have a proper writing system. There are some signs that they can use a sort of tally system to record numbers, along with simple pictograms to record basic ideas. But this was simply for record-keeping purposes. I saw no inscriptions, signs, or books. All I saw were very rudimentary clay tablets with borders of ether metal or some sort of whitish bone. These were only used by a select few, typically those who were adorned with piles of gold jewelry and deep, rich body coloration, as they stared at the various operations going on throughout the settlement. This reinforced my idea that this primitive writing system was just rudimentary and used for basic recording purposes. They may not have a government in the way that we know it, although I cannot say for sure. In some ways, their society resembled communism, with simple property and any available supplies or nourishment being available to all of the swine things at any time, with large troughs and dispensaries located all along the streets, which were frequented by both the colored and the poorest of the swine things, without discrimination. However, in other ways, this was a clearly statistical society, with everyone having an assigned job which they seemed to do repetitively, with no rest or input on how these operations were done. Some of the hogmen were bringing in massive bags of fungus from the fields. Others were pulverizing this fungi with great round stones which they would raise up and drop into the mortars with a tacking noise before spinning them, grinding the fungi into a fine slurry. Others brought foul-smelling bags through the streets and towards the fungal fields, while others seemed to be butchering some unknown meat nearby. Rarer were smiths and stone carvers who seemed to specialize in crafting tools. Clearly, government was the wrong word to describe this place, since each individual seemed to be assigned a specific job, which they did willingly and continuously, more like an insect colony than a proper civilization. However, I should keep my inferences to a minimum, since I only caught glimpses of the society as I was carried along. And although the journey only lasted what I believe to be an hour, it may have been significantly shorter or longer, I cannot be sure, as it is known that stress and terror can affect the mind in bizarre ways. Either way, we eventually stopped and turned down a side street towards a nondescript building. However, I heard pained and confused sounds erupting from within, which sounded both strangely familiar and terrifying. And as we approached, I saw my first glimpse of the humans that lived here. There was another human there, although it took me a moment to identify it as such, who was being carried into the facility by one of the swine things. Its skin and hair were pale and sickly-looking, resembling one of the native Sami of Finland or perhaps an albino. It was still clearly human, despite several noticeably physical alterations. For instance, its ears had been removed and its hands looked deformed somehow. But this was clearly more human than the swine things, and my eyes were drawn by its terror as it was forcibly dragged into the building. The human screeched in morbid howls and shook like a timid wild animal as it was carried inside. As my captor carried me into the building as well, I saw something new that added to my horror so much that I became lightheaded, with my eyes becoming unfocused, and it was only by chance that I did not pass out from the shock of what I saw. There was a thin corridor with metallic bars and grating on either side. The beast carried me down the passage where another swine beast greeted my captor. This one coated in white powder and sporting an assortment of piercings through its many folds of fat. I took this moment to look around and I saw a confusing and obscene image. I will now attempt to describe what I saw in the human section of the city with as few of my personal interpretations as possible. You may then judge for yourself, openly and in an unbiased way, the true purpose that these humans were being raised for. There were no windows here, and the only illumination came from the single glass tube running across the ceiling which contained the luminescent ether that powered this civilization, and which branched off into the cells, possibly to provide power for unseen machinery. Each of the sectioned-off cells had wide doorways leading between one another for easy access by the swine things, although in most cases a heavy flat slab, immovable to the humans, but easily rolled aside by the powerful swine things, was placed in front of the doorway. This seems to be the closest thing that the swine beasts had to proper doors, and indeed all of the other architecture I had seen featured open doorways with no obstruction. Past the birthing chambers were even stranger areas. First we saw a very small room where several newborn livestock were kept in small, cold stone shelves that lined the wall. The swine things that worked in this area would pick up the livestock with a shocking recklessness and slap them onto a nearby stone table, possibly to inspect them, which obviously causing the livestock to squeeze their eyes shut and cry. The entire area created a roaring screech as the livestock cried, completely inconsolable. One of the swine things was in the middle of a simple procedure. He held a large chisel or nail against one of the livestock fingers and smashed it with a round stone. The creature did this again and again, removing the last digit of each of the livestock's fingers, which might explain the seemingly deformed hands I kept seeing on these humans. Why they went to this trouble of altering the humans' bodies at infancy, I can't rightly say. This led into the next area, which was composed of very small square cells, larger than the infant area, but smaller than the birthing chamber. Branching pathways led off to the side, exposing even more cells located deep in the facility. Although the cells were very confined, overall this was the largest area thus far, due to the sheer number of cells. The swine thing carried me past these cells, and the sight within them is what finally broke my sanity. The humans inside were not infants, but older children and adults. Their bodies were grotesquely swollen, their limbs atrophied and useless. They lay in their own filth, their pale, distended forms glistening under the eerie light, their mouths moving in a constant silent mew. But it was the smell that told the true story. A sweet, cloying, fatty odor that clung to the back of the throat. It was the smell of stock, of marrow, of an animal being prepared for the slaughter. They were being fattened. The slender, proboscis-like tendrils burrowing into their flesh were not just altering them, they were marinating them, infusing their very substance with whatever nutrients or flavors the swine things desired. They were livestock in the most literal sense, and the realization that I was to become a part of this larder, that my own body would be bloated and rendered down into food, ignited a final primal surge of terror. My captor handed me over to the white pigmented swine thing, who examined me with a cold, clinical detachment, its tiny black eyes assessing my potential yield. As it turned to pick up a cruel-looking tool, a scalpel of obsidian or some dark glass, I twisted violently. My slick sweat and slime-covered body slipped from its grasp. I hit the polished stone floor and scrambled on all fours, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I did not think, I only ran. Back down the corridor, past the birthing chambers, through the gauntlet of startled clicks and guttural shouts. I burst out of the building and into the geometric streets fleeing through an alien metropolis. I plunged back into the foul muck of the fungal fields, the chattering roar of the swarm behind me. My eyes, sharpened by terror, found not the original fissure, but a smaller, darker opening nearby. The timbered mouth of an abandoned mine shaft, a forgotten scratch on the world's surface. I scrambled into its welcoming blackness, the sound of my own gasping breath echoing back as a promise of a world that was still mine. I fled upward through the crumbling shaft, my bare feet torn on forgotten track ties, my shoulders scraping against splintered supports. I did not stop until I saw, far above, a pinprick of light. I hauled myself out into the vast, silent desert, collapsing at the surface. I was free of the city, but I would never be free of the knowledge of what dwells beneath and the terrible purpose for which they farm mankind.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel as more green texts will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.